Welcome back, everybody, to First Round Frenzy. Matt and Kole here. We are finishing up the South with the NFC South. Another, let's say, interesting division, to say the least, over the past few years. Lots of turnover in terms of just, I mean, one year a team's on top, the next it's on the bottom. They're all these teams do not know how to maintain winning. So we'll see what happens, but it should be interesting. A lot of high draft picks. All four teams have top 20 picks, including two top 10 picks. So, Kole, should be a fun one.
Yeah, it should be. And even at the quarterback position, this is such a fun division because you got Bryce Young, who you hoping takes a jump in year three, maybe. You
We'll
got Baker
see.
Mayfield, who's found a resurgence, back-to-back division champ with the Buccaneers and kind of turned his career around in Tampa Bay. Derek Carr's maybe on the way out in New
Yeah, Spencer
Orleans.
Rattler, someone else. I don't know. We'll see.
We'll talk about it. And maybe in the Atlanta Falcons, Kirk Cousins making a lot of money on the pine while Michael Penix Jr. takes over in 2025. So even the quarterback position makes this a very fun division. But we'll see. I mean, the Buccaneers have pretty much been running things since Tom Brady arrived and then Baker Mayfield took over after him, continuously winning this division. So we'll see if somebody can come out on top here that isn't the Buccaneers and try to challenge it. But one that, pretty much my whole life following football, all these division games in the NFC North. I mean, even being a Carolina native, I always loved like the old school Carolina games when they would go up against the Saints and go up against the Bucks and the Falcons. So I think it's always been a fun division in my eyes.
Yeah, it's always competitive, which is always fun. And as you mentioned, lots of young quarterbacks. So you never know what can happen. Bryce Young, as you mentioned, if he can make that turn in third year, maybe the Panthers end up doing something. Same with the Falcons. Michael Penix ends up being the savior over there. They can make a quick turn as well because there is some talent on these rosters. So we can get right into it. The Panthers have the highest pick in the draft this coming year at 8. So we'll start with them. Kole, run us through what they've done in free agency so far and, what we should be expecting over the next few weeks.
Yeah, they kind of got bullied in free agency because they had the money and they were trying to be aggressive and going out and getting guys, but they just got bullied by other teams. I mean, they almost landed Milton Williams, who's one of the highest prized free agents on the cycle, and they had the deal like pretty much done. And New England came in, as Milton Williams said, at the buzzer and just gave him, an absurd contract, made him the highest paid Patriot of all time, and you can't turn that down. He ended up in New England. So then they kind of just had to pivot. They got behind on the D tackle market because of it. They still landed two in Bobby Brown and Tershawn Wharton. I think they gave Tershawn Wharton a little more money than he needed, but they had to spend the money somewhere that they had. I did like Trayvon Moehrig at safety. I thought that was a good addition for him. I don't know what they're doing at the running back position. They paid Chuba Hubbard, then they traded up and get Jonathan Brooks, who tore his ACL again. So then they brought in Rico Dowell and cut Miles Sanders, who went over to Dallas to take
I
over
mean,
for
that's the
Rico
running back
Dowdle.
market if you've ever if you've ever heard of it right there.
Yeah, it's like the least valued position. For some reason, this Panthers regime with Dan Morgan and Dave Canales keep prioritizing an undervalued position with three different players now at running back. So they're an interesting team. They're trying to build around Bryce Young and the best way possible. I believe in Dan Morgan and Dave Canales. I think this is a good regime to try to hopefully fix this team and get the opportunity to, because it seems like these are guys that David Tepper wanted to bring in, and he's not going to have a short leash on him like he did with Frank Wright and the previous general manager. So we'll see what happens, but it's you know we'll see. I mean, they're going to be aggressive in some form in this draft. Dan Morgan talked about they want to be aggressive in getting playmakers. That can mean both sides, offense or defense. So is Tyler Warren or Ted McMillan on the board, maybe at 8 to give Bryce Young another weapon? I know they just got Xavier Legette and Jalen Coker last year, but maybe you throw in one of those two guys potentially. The other thing too is the defense. Dave Canales said we have to address the needs on defense first. And I still think that's on the defensive line in some form or fashion. So we'll see what happens, but they still got a lot of holes to fill in this Carolina team, and they're going to try to be aggressive in finally filling those.
Yeah. And I feel like that's something where if I'm a Carolina Panthers fan, I'm actually very disappointed in how everything's turned out so far this offseason.
Yeah.
Because we mentioned Baker Mayfield, obviously, with the Buccaneers, who we'll talk about later. Two times in a row now they've won the division, but they're not a very strong team, right? I mean, they don't they're not a Kansas City Chiefs or even, a Buffalo Bills. They're nothing like that. And you come in here with a young quarterback who you spent obviously a lot of draft capital on. You feel like you can quickly be a contender for the division, and now you're just getting beat out and beat out and beat out. And you're going in here, we're just a little over 2 weeks away from the draft. I think if you're a Carolina Panthers fan, you are going to be very, very critical of what happens here, especially when you have a top 10 pick in this draft. If you don't get someone, I think the fans would be very disappointed with this offseason.
Yeah, and they have been for a while. As I know, like I said, being back in North Carolina, there a lot of people around here are not happy with the Carolina Panthers and their recent moves, or lack thereof. So we'll see what happens. But I mean, they got plenty of draft picks. They got 9 draft picks. They got, uh, was it 5 in rounds 4 and 5 total in that range? So maybe Dan Morgan and Dave Canales try to trade up again for someone they like. Maybe that's a wide receiver potentially, in the third round or something. So we'll see what happens here. But I think, what Dave Canales said, looking ahead to the eighth overall pick, I think it's going to be a defensive guy. I don't think it's going to be Ted McMillan. I don't think it's going to be Tyler Warren. Mason Graham, he's intriguing because I mean they went
He
and
drops,
have
yeah.
yeah, he heavily pursued Milton Williams and you didn't get him. Mason Graham fills that similar role in the interior defensive front next to Derek Brown. So if he drops to 8, that's intriguing. Maybe not likely. They're doing a lot of work on Shamar Stewart right now, trying to see if he's maybe worth the potential over the production. But I keep coming back to Jalen Walker, and I think Jalen Walker, they put a lot of work into him. He's been linked extensively to the team for months now. I still think he's the guy as a tweener linebacker, defensive end hybrid that can bring some energy to that defense.
I was gonna say Jalen Walker to the Panthers has been the most consistent pairing, other than like this
Probably the entire
this
cycle.
been so consistent for the entire cycle. It's like it's a first overall pick, right?
Yeah.
So, months before, oh, this is probably who's going to be the first overall pick. That's what it feels like with Jalen Walker. Because everywhere I look, Jalen Walker is going number 8 to the Carolina Panthers, and it makes sense, right? I mean, they do have holes on defense. You mentioned how that regime wants to fill in those holes there right now, and Jalen Walker is one of the premier hybrid players in this class, right? You're going to bring him in. He's an elite edge setter. He can play off ball linebacker. He can rush the passer. He's effective in the run game. So you bring him in. He's a leader, which is also very key. We talked about that in the linebacker segment a few weeks ago. He's a guy that can come in, be a leader on that defense, set the tone, and then you just put him in whatever position he fits best in that defense, or whatever position you feel least confident in. So I think that makes all the sense in the world. Obviously, if Mason Graham drops, I think that might at least spark conversation about what you do there. Because obviously, both of us have Mason Graham as a top 5 player in the class potentially. But Jalen Walker does seem to be the pick there at 8.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people torn on him, but I think he's like the safest pick they can make.
Yeah.
If Mason Graham's not on the board, because like I said, Shamar Stewart's not a safe pick by any means. Neither is Ted McMillan. Uh, Tyler Warren could be, but I don't necessarily know if that's a need they want to address early in the draft. So in terms of the 8th pick and the options that are going to be there for him, he's the safest option. He's got the sideline to sideline speed. You can put him at either position. I think they have a really strong-minded defensive coordinator in Evero who can make him work wherever he wants to play him at. So that's a great pick at 8. And then looking to the second round, I had Xavier Watts. I think we talked about him before, but I think they need a safety on the back end of that defense. They brought in Trayvon Moehrig, but they lost Xavier Woods and Jordan Fuller. So I still think they can add a deep safety to that unit because Moehrig's kind of, you like to move him down a little bit. He's a more physical safety, but as a back end coverage guy, you need someone like Xavier Watts in the back end of the secondary. And then the third round, again, I think they might move and try to get a second, third round pick, because they had, like I said, the stockpile in the 4th and 5th rounds. But right now I got Jalen Noel. He recently met with the Panthers. He was in Carolina, for that top 30 visit. And I've always talked about loving this guy. The footwork he has, moving out of the slot. I think you have a really strong young trio in Xavier Legette, Jalen Coker, and Jalen Noel to grow with Bryce Young over the next 4 to 5 years and, see who elevates and becomes a top tier option in that offense. And Jalen Noel, like I said, like he can beat people in man with his footwork. He knows zone coverages and how to beat zone coverages. He's the perfect thing that, Bryce Young could have in his offense and be a safe, reliable target.
Yeah. I mean that makes all the sense in the world. I mean, you look back to 2020, Panthers hit big with Jeremy Chin in the second round as a safety coming out of the draft. Obviously, he was a 4-year starter for them up until he ended up going to Washington this past year. Now you kind of try to replace that production, right, with a guy like Xavier Watts, who, I mean, some people have him as a top 2 safety in this class, right? I mean, yes, there's Nicky Manwari and Malachi Starks, but I believe he's right up there. He's kind of been thrown under the radar a little bit because of how good they are. But Xavier Watts is definitely a steal in the second round. And Jalen Noel, you and I have talked about him this entire process. He's a guy that's going to have 80, 90 plus catches in a good offense. He can play outside, he can play in the slot. He's going to be a very, very good target for Bryce Young if he ends up in Carolina.
Yeah, that's two of my favorite fits right now is Jalen Noel to Carolina and Jalen Walker to Carolina.
Yep.
Those two guys, I think that's really strong fits of what they need, really strong fits of their culture they're building, with their offensive and defensive coaches. So right now, I kind of like those two guys as locked in picks for me.
All right, so let's just move one pick ahead, and that is New Orleans Saints at number 9. And this team is very interesting because I think we'll get into free agency, but just to start off here, their pick at 9 is all depending on what happens in the top 3. I think there are a bunch of options of what they could do here. Is it choose a high potential defensive player like a Shamar Stewart? Is it going for one of the quarterbacks? If they're there, is it trade back if you don't like what's there? So I think this because they don't have a lot of draft capital. So there's a bunch of options there. We'll get into that in a little bit, but they are very interesting here at number 9. Now the Saints are very famous for having no money because they spend it all on players and then have a very difficult time of having to restructure everybody and figure things out. I think this offseason they've done a decent job of bringing in some players to fill some holes as well as bringing back some key players. Obviously, Juwan Johnson coming in. He was their starting tight end over the past 2 years. Is he one of the best? No, but he's been very consistent in the passing game, decent blocker as well in the run game. Wide receiver, obviously, Chris Olave has had some injury issues. Number 1 receiver, really good when healthy. They brought in some decent help. I mean, it's going to be wide receiver 3s and 4 when you look at Dante Pettis, as well as I forget who the other guy was that they brought in, but I'll find it at some point.
Brandon Cooks.
Brandon Cooks, yes. So again, wide receiver 3s and 4s that they bring in there to help out whoever ends up being the quarterback week 1. And then the 2 biggest signings were on the defensive side of the ball. Obviously, re-signing Chase Young to a 3-year contract extension. That's big. They had some issues over the past few years in rushing the passer. Obviously, they're very well known for drafting some interesting pass rushers in the first round. Marcus Davenport, well above consensus, and Peyton Turner, well above consensus. So good to sign in he was a number 2 pick in the NFL draft, and he's been very, very solid. So if he can have a little bit of a resurgent year, he's been down the last 2 or 3 years or so, but if he can have a resurgent year, that's great. And then their secondary was in a lot of trouble. And they bring in Justin Reed, Kansas City Chiefs. He's been very, very solid back end as a safety, and I think he's going to make a big difference in that secondary.
Yeah, I like the moves they've done too. And I mean, they got to figure out that quarterback position. Is Derek Carr going to be the guy? Are they going to give Spencer Rattler another look? And I also wonder what Kellen Moore does with a running back position because I know they got Alvin Kamara a couple more years on him, but they've done a little bit of work on some of the running backs in this class. I don't know if they're really comfortable with Kendre Miller being that number 2 back, and they have Jordan Mims and then Clyde Edwards-Helaire behind Kendre Miller. I think you can add a stronger RB2 in there that can be a long-term RB1, if and when it's time to move on from a franchise legend like Alvin Kamara. But, Kellen Moore coming in makes this, things a lot more interesting because I think they try to upgrade that wide receiver position. I think they try to potentially upgrade the running back position long-term with him. But I think they do have a good guy in there, on the offense. I think Kellen Moore, it's, long been time for him to get a head coach opportunity. And I'm excited to see what he does with this team and then this unit moving forward. But he's inheriting a tough group that's, needs some upgrades at some key
Yeah.
positions in the next few years.
Yeah. And you say they need some upgrades, but we've also seen the flashes, right? They've,
Yeah.
they've shown that when healthy, they
They were
can
one of the most
yeah,
explosive teams in like the first 4 weeks last year. They were going
exactly. Like
crazy.
they have a lot of potential. If Derek Carr can stay healthy, or if a quarterback ends up really showing out in training camp, they end up being it. Most likely Derek Carr week one. But if Derek Carr's healthy, if Chris Olave stays healthy, if Alvin Kamara starts out hot, I mean, they can be a very, very good football team and they can challenge for the division. I'm not saying they're getting 10 wins, but they can get 7 or 8 and potentially win the division with that. I mean, it's that kind of division where if you can get 7, 8, 9 wins, you can win it because they just beat up on each other, right?
Yeah.
So it'll be very interesting to see what happens, but we can get right into the draft here because what happens from 1 to 3 is going to determine what happens at 9. We've talked a lot about the Giants. What are they going to do at 3? Is it going to be Abdul Carter if he drops? If it's Travis Hunter that drops, is he the pick at 3? Or do they still go with Shador Sanders? I am personally still on the train that they are going to go Shador Sanders because they are desperate. But for the case of this mock draft, I am going Shador Sanders, pick 9 to the New Orleans Saints. I think it makes sense. Shador Sanders is a guy that, there's a lot of question marks about him going through the media. I think a lot of that is just the media being media, looking for clicks, going after Dion, that kind of thing, right? Shador is a plenty good quarterback. Is he my number 1 quarterback? No. Is he my number 2? No, but his floor is much higher than a lot of the other quarterbacks in this class. He is a straight-up pocket passer. His athletic ability is not the best, but it's not as bad as everybody says. And he's one of the smartest quarterbacks in this draft when it comes to football IQ. His ability to process the game pre and post snap is probably the best in the class. Maybe not as good as Kyle McCord. I love Kyle McCord. I think he might be a little bit higher, but still, the point is he's a guy that can come in, and if Derek Carr struggles the first few weeks, if he beats out Spencer Rattler, he could be QB1 by the halfway through the season. I don't think there's any question about that. I think Kellen Moore's a guy that would be able to get the best out of him. Now, before I get into the other picks, if Shador Sanders goes 3, the question becomes, is it Jackson Dart or do you trade back? I think, we were talking about the Colts last week and what they could potentially do. You mentioned the Bears, potentially a team that might go for Tyler Warren at 10. Are Colts a team that might want to trade up to 9, get Tyler Warren? Saints drop back, take their time if Shador is not there, go and get still a high-quality defensive player at 14 and also get some draft capital because that's something they are desperately in need of. So that's something to keep an eye on if Shador Sanders isn't available at 9. Then we move into the second round, pick 40, and I'm going defense here. I think the secondary I mentioned, they get Justin Reed to help out in the safety room, but the cornerback room is still very weak. Obviously, you get rid of Marshawn Lattimore, who was your star defensive player for years, and you haven't been able to replace him with a high-quality player. So with that, I'm going Trey Amos, cornerback out of Ole Miss. He's a guy that's been getting plenty of first-round hype in the second half of that. But the problem is, recent reports, a lot of quarterbacks potentially going at the end of round 1. So a lot of those late first-round picks are kind of being used on quarterbacks, most likely. We're going to see teams trade in, and those teams that were looking at Trey Amos are probably going to trade back into the second round and maybe not be able to get him early on. So he's a guy that could easily slip to 40. Saints get a true number 1 outside corner who's physical. I really like that one. Pick 71 of round 3, Jack Betch, wide receiver out of TCU. Started off at LSU, was a big-time target for them, right? He outperformed a lot of the LSU wide receivers that were there in his first year there. And he's going to come back to New Orleans, and he's going to be that physical presence, right? Chris Olave is shifty, wide receiver 1, deep threat. Jack Betch is going to be that over-the-middle, contested catch, physical guy. Perfect complement to Chris Olave in that passing game. And then finally, at pick 93, I go Kyle Kennard, edge rusher out of South Carolina. I already mentioned that they brought back Chase Young on a 3-year extension, but I still think that they could use some help in that pass rushing room. I think Kyle Kennard's one of the more underrated guys in this class, and he's a guy that's going to make an immediate impact off the edge. So I was thinking about potentially going running back here as well, as you mentioned, but I think they can wait until day 3 and get a guy early there. But
Yeah.
that's what I'm thinking. If the Saints did this, I think they'd be very happy with what they came out with.
Yeah, I'm glad you took the Saints because there's not a GM I hate more than trying to predict Mickey Loomis with the Saints. Every year they burn me on my mock drafts. I have no idea what they're going to do. I still don't right now.
Nope.
I do. I have what you have right now. I have Shedeur Sanders right now penciled in at 9, but like that is penciled in half a race right now. Like I like the two letters like S of the first name and S in the second name. I don't know if I'm just keeping that right there, just the SS of maybe Shedeur Sanders. So I don't know what they're going to do because he might not even be there at 9, like you said. But Dion's talked a lot about New Orleans. New
Yep.
Orleans is the betting favorite right
At
now to
the
sign
at the pro
Shedeur.
day, he was like, "I like the black and gold." I mean,
He did say that.
it's
So
looking like that.
we'll see. And like looking at their top 30 visits, they're meeting with a lot of second round options.
Yep.
And they looked at Siobhan Revel. I wonder if maybe the injury concerns
He was
drop
another
him.
one I was looking at
Yeah,
40. Yep.
he could be an option at 40. But they also looked at some tackles: Josh Connerly Jr., Ariante Arsary. Two left tackle options that maybe they bring in to give Trevor Penning just a boost in some competition, or maybe you move Penning inside. Um, Quinn Ewers, you mentioned him, I think, with the Saints.
Indy
No, I
though.
mentioned him with this.
Indy.
I
I
mentioned him with
still
the
think it's
Saints.
Indy. Still think
Yeah,
it's
I
Indy
mentioned
though.
him with the Saints. So maybe he's a late guy if they can't get Shedeur, or
Yep.
maybe they go day 3 and get Quinn Ewers. So they're meeting with some interesting prospects right now. But yeah, I like this list. I like Trey Amos. I think corner second round is probably the sweet spot for the Saints. I don't know what they do at 9 because I had Will Johnson there originally.
Yep.
I think
I had
corners
Will
are
Johnson. That
unique.
was my first mock draft. I had Will Johnson, and then I moved
Yeah,
to Tet, and now I've moved to Shador. But for all I know, they're going to choose like Shamar Stewart at 9 because that's what they do is overreach on edge rushers. So
yeah, that wouldn't
if you want to
surprise
be
me.
safe, I'd probably go Shamar Stewart.
And then Jack Beck, I love. Like you said, that's a perfect compliment to both what they have in Brandon Cooks, bringing him back as a downfield guy, but also an older veteran. And then you have Chris Olave, like you said, he can be a downfield guy. He's a shifty guy on the outside. So Jack Beck, excuse me, like you said, over the middle kind of guy, contested catch. That would be perfect for whoever their quarterback is to
Because we know they love
attack that
throwing it
area of the field.
downfield in
Yeah.
contested situations. So he would be very, very good in that offense.
Yeah, and that would definitely work well for Kellen Moore having multiple different options to go with the the passing game as well. So I like those. I think that's the kind of we'll see what happens with Shedeur Sanders, but definitely a wide receiver like Jack Beck, a late round running back and a cornerback seems like the most safe moves to predict for the Saints right now.
All right, so let's move on. We're going to go to the division winners, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So
All right.
they are a very interesting team because, I mean, they've been very consistent over the past few years, right? I mean, they're not blowing anybody out of the water, but they're consistent. They make it to the playoffs. They put some pressure on the other playoff teams in the playoffs, and they're competitive in those games as well. So they're a team that I think with a few additions could be maybe not contenders to win a Super Bowl, but contenders to make a run in the playoffs if they can get the right pieces in there. So Cole, how have they attacked this offseason so far?
Yeah, I mean, going back to last year real quick, I mean, this offense and like they looked good, but going back and looking at the numbers, I was astonished with how good they actually were. I mean, they were top 5 offensive line, which I expected, but they were third in passing yards, fourth in rushing yards, third in total offense, fourth in scoring offense, all top 5 ranks. And their defense was actually, we knew it because that's what happened in the playoffs when Washington kind of ran away with it on them. But from a Todd Bowles team, this is just not what I was expecting to see in 2024. Was the offense absolutely go nuclear and be top of the league and the defense fall? I mean, they were bottom 3 in passing yards allowed. So that right there is kind of where this team needed to address, and they didn't in the offseason. They needed to upgrade the cornerback room and the safety room. They didn't bring really anybody in to help with that. They brought in Vildor from Detroit at corner, but he's not going to be a guy that you rely on to be a starter. And then they already have Jamel Dean, who they're worried about, with his injuries. And then it's just overall. bad in that secondary outside of Anton Winfield Jr., who's an absolute stud. But he can't just rely on that one guy. I mean, Zion McCollum's going to be their cornerback one just because he's not going to get hurt, is basically what Todd
Yep.
Bowles was
Yep.
saying. So it's interesting that Jason Light said that we could use more help there at corner, and Todd Bowles said the same thing. We don't have a lot of depth at corner. That's crystal clear. That's from the league meetings and from the combine. So it's clear they're going to go that direction at some point in the draft. They go there early. I'm not sure, if it's going to be a first round guy. Well, I mean, we'll get into it, but you know, the defense needs to be addressed. They need some edge rushers and they need some major, major upgrades in the starting cornerback and safety department going into next season because I think the offense is fine. They brought back Chris Godwin. They got some young guys that stepped up like Bucky Irving, Jalen McMillan to go with Mike Evans and the rest of the offense. So they're right perfect where they need to be because the offensive line stacked too. So it's just about upgrading that defense from here on out.
And we saw in that playoff game that the secondary is a point of weakness, right? As soon as Zion McCollum got injured, I mean, they got smoked. They had no one that could
Yeah.
play on the outside effectively against high level wide receivers. So I think that's definitely something that they need to work on. I've seen a lot of people mock corners. I've seen a lot of people mock safeties, one of the top two safeties there, and Nicky Manwari and Malachi Starks as well. We're looking at, I mean, Jahdae Barron is dropping. Will Johnson is dropping. I mean, we could see one or both of those guys potentially at night. I mean, when the way that this draft is kind of panning out, and the way that I'm seeing it through social media right now, is that there is a world where the Buccaneers have their choice of secondary players. There
Mhm.
is a world where, other than Travis Hunter, every single secondary player in this draft will be available to them at 19.
Yeah.
So I think when I'm looking at it, that is the best case scenario for this team right now is they can have whoever they want in the position that they need most. And if they get the position that they need most, there is no question in my mind that they're favorites to win the division once again and potentially win a playoff game or two.
Yeah, and I think based on looking at different mock drafts for this team, the way everything's leaning, there's three needs on that defense. They need an edge rusher, they need a linebacker, and they need a corner. And some capacity, that's going to be their three picks.
Yep.
Is it, a Jahdae Barron or a Will Johnson in the first round? Is it Jahad Campbell at linebacker in the first round? Is it, I've seen Jalen Walker was mentioned a lot. I had him, of course, like we just talked about, mocked to Carolina, and I think he's going to be off the board, in the first top 10 picks. So I don't think he's going to be there, but they're looking at some edge rushers. James Pierce makes a lot of sense in that
Yep.
scheme fit with Todd Bowles. So in some capacity, it's going to be corner, linebacker, defensive end. They have to attack the defense at those three spots with their first three picks, and it's just what they want to, uh, or where they feel the depth is. I mean, I don't, I've talked about it before. I don't like the depth at the cornerback room, especially when you get past day two. So I think you try to address that early, but we'll see what happens. I think those three have to be the spots you look at, though.
All right, so let's get right into it then. They've got pick 19, 53, and 84. And I'm assuming they're going 1, 2, 3 with those three positions. We'll see. Kole, who do you have going at 19?
So I got Jahdae Barron at 19. I talked about it a couple weeks ago. I don't remember which show it was that we were talking about, but I was like, I have a strong fit for Tampa Bay that's already penciled, or not penciled in. Like I have it markered in and it's staying on there. And that's Jahdae Barron, Tampa Bay. I think he is an alpha for that cornerback room that they really need. If they want to put him on the inside or maybe put him on the outside. Either way, wherever they put him, he's going to bring a lot of energy and juice back to that Tampa Bay defense because they really need it. They need another hard hitter like Anton Winfield Jr. that can take, that passing number down and knock some balls out of guys' hands in the secondary and quit allowing big plays on that back end. So I really like the fit there at 19 if he's on the board. And if not, if someone reaches on, or takes Jahdae Barron above 19, I'm fine with Jihad Campbell. But right now, I mean, that's as locked in as it is for me as Jahdae Barron at 19. In the second round, I considered Carson Schwarzenegger,
Okay.
but I wanted to wait on linebacker just because we already talked a little bit about him a couple of times. So I've got Landon Jackson. I think another, I'm going off Todd Bowles guys here. An athletic defensive end out of Arkansas, really killed it at the combine. And so I like him in the second round, give some, pass rush juice to that defense as well. And then I got the linebacker at pick 84 in Demetrius Knight, another hard hitting. I think I've talked about him. He was like my bullet bill of the linebacker
Yep.
class because he
Yep.
will fly in and just run people over, and you're not going to get up after he hits you. So you add a guy like that to Todd Bowles' defense. Like this is all hard hitters, athletic guys in Jahdae Barron, Landon Jackson, Demetrius Knight, who like they're not going to get ran through by a team like the Washington Commanders again.
Oh yeah.
You're going to absolutely dominate opposing offenses with Todd Bowles getting back in the saddle and being a strong defensive coordinator again in 2025 if these three picks come true.
Yeah. I really, really like this mock draft here. I think if this happens, I think at edge rusher, there's, potential for some other, it depends on who's available there. I like Landon Jackson. He's in my top 100. He's definitely a great player, but I think that's the one where, maybe a different edge rusher if other people are available. Other than that, I mean, I think Jahdae Barron makes tremendous sense, right? You can put him on the outside, you can put him on the inside. He can play as a dime linebacker even if you need to. And so he's very scheme averse. He can get in there and do whatever you need to, and he's a leader. Demetrius Knight, we've talked about a lot. He is a big time hitter, and he's in both of our top 5 linebackers, at least from our previous shows. And he is probably the hardest hitter out of all the linebackers in this class. So really like that there. The Carson Schwessinger shout in the second round is interesting. I think personally, I think he's going to be gone by pick 53. So I think that's why this mock draft seems very realistic of what could potentially play out on draft weekend. So yeah, no, if the Buccaneers came away with this after Sunday of the draft or Saturday of the draft, sorry, I think you are perfectly fine, and you are going in saying we are favorites to win this division. We should win 10 games. I think if you come away with this.
Yeah, that pick in the second round was the hardest for me to consider because I wanted a guy like Nick Scourton. I wanted a guy like Donovan Izaraku, but that's the 21st pick in the second round at 53. There's going to be a lot of guys that come off the board. If there's a run on edge rushers at the end of the first, like we're expected to see, it's going to be slim pickings of who's on the board there. So that's why I like Landon Jackson. I think he's a safe prospect. Just he's a fundamentally sound player. He was very athletic from what he showed at the combine. So yeah, I wanted to try to be realistic. And the same thing
Yep.
with Carson Schlesinger. Like that's such a late second round pick that you got to be careful of who's actually still going to be on the board there when you're projecting it. But I'm proud of this one too. I think this would be pretty solid for the Buccaneers.
All right. All right. So now let's move on to the Atlanta Falcons, who, obviously have had an interesting last, second half of the season through now. Benching Kirk Cousins. Obviously, he's a huge cap hit to them, but they believe in Michael Penix Jr. That was the surprise of the draft last year. I'm honestly surprised I forgot to mention that earlier on when we were talking about surprise draft picks. But they picked him at 8, and they're rolling with him, right? I mean, even though they still have Kirk Cousins on the roster, they're bringing in Matt Ryan to come and help Michael
Coach him
Penix out in
along.
the offseason, coach him along. So they don't even trust Kirk Cousins to coach him along. So that is sounding more and more likely that Kirk Cousins will be traded at some point in the near future, whether it's before the draft or most likely after the draft. So very interesting to see what happens there. But other than that, I think the Falcons are in a very interesting situation where they don't have much draft capital in the beginning part of the draft. They have a few holes, but they're also one of the more ready teams in this division to compete because they have a lot of talent that hasn't really gotten to their potential, right? Looking at Kyle Pitts, we're looking at Drake London. On the defensive side of the ball, they have some studs as well, like Ronald Ebiketie and others. So they've got a very, very interesting setup. And if they hit and Michael Penix Jr. is a semi-decent starting quarterback this year, they're a team that can be challenging for a top 2 spot in this division and potentially putting some pressure on the Bucs.
Yeah.
They had a top 10 offensive line in the league last year.
Yep.
They were decent in pass rush. They hurried a lot. They didn't get a lot of sacks. I believe they were third to last in the league in sacks, but they created a bunch of pressures, top 15 in the league. So on both sides of the ball, they are pretty decent. The biggest holes, in my opinion, are the secondary. They brought back Mike Hughes. They re-signed him. But other than that, they struggled in the passing game. And then on the offensive side of the ball, I'm looking at adding a potential another weapon. for Michael Penix because Kyle Pitts and Drake London have both not proven to be reliable. And then you move down into Ray McLeod and Darnell Mooney, who, are great to have, but you'd probably rather have them as number three options at wide receiver. So I think those are the two places where, maybe not in the first two picks, because you have to look at the value as well of where you are. But I think those are the positions that they probably need to address the most.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how this offense looks with full offseason and full support and Michael Penix. I think it's hilarious of what they said last week that Kirk Cousins isn't expected to participate in voluntary team workouts. Like the guy's not even gonna go show up to work because he doesn't want to be there that bad
Yep.
and he wants to play somewhere. So we'll see what the situation unfolds there. Probably after the draft, a team that doesn't get a quarterback, maybe they try to bring Kirk Cousins in, and the Falcons. I don't know why they would want to get rid of him because Emory Jones isn't going to be your QB2, and you're already paying the guy, so why not just keep him as QB2 and tell him to suck it up? But I mean, we'll see what the Kirk Cousins issue, how that gets resolved. But overall, the offense is Michael Penix,
Yeah.
and Michael Penix's offense to run now with Kyle Pitts, with like you said, Drake London, with Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier. They got some fun pieces to make it a fun, surprising offense. I think if Michael Penix can be the guy that can lead this team. I think Zach Robinson's one of my favorite young offensive coordinators and
Yep.
offensive minds, and I want him to one day, be a head coach down the line. So we'll see what happens. But at some point, this Falcons team has to address the edge rusher position. I
Yeah.
mean, they have to. I've
Yep.
mocked it every year the last like 4 years, and they refuse to do it. They keep drafting offensive guys in the first round.
Yep.
At some point, they need an
They
edge
need to
rusher.
do it.
They brought in Leonard Floyd to good veteran presence, but they need a young, dominant edge rusher on
Yep.
this team that can really turn that defense around.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned it here. I mean, yes, they re-signed Mike Hughes, they brought in Leonard Floyd, but when you look at their signings from free agency, it was mostly offensive players. I mean, they
Yeah,
brought in Kadero Hodge. Yes, great addition to the offense. And then you bring in a bunch of offensive linemen, right? You extend Jake Matthews, which is huge, by the way. That was very, very necessary, especially with your young quarterback coming in.
yeah,
But I'm scrolling through their free agency tracker. I'm looking at offensive tackle, left tackle, offensive lineman, offensive lineman, like it long snapper. Like, you're going through this and they're doing a great job in building through the trenches, but I'm not seeing them kind of spread the wealth to the rest of the roster. And especially when I've mentioned the secondary is extremely weak and the edge rusher, they haven't addressed, they haven't brought, other than Ebikite, they don't really have a young edge rusher in that room to make a difference.
yeah.
So we'll get into my mock draft in a second. We'll see if it comes true. But based on recent history, it's very unlikely that they go with an edge rusher or even a defensive player at all if they like an offensive player at 15.
And we'll see what happens. But I mean, golly, that's driving me nuts. Not ever addressing that position. So we'll see. But I mean, again, like we said with the Buccaneers, I think the defense needs to be the priority with this Falcons team. I mean, they got a defensive-minded head coach, just like Tampa Bay.
Yep.
You need to start getting some pieces on there that your head coach can start utilizing with that team.
Yep. The Falcons and the Packers just need to switch front offices for a year, and all of the problems will be solved. But let's get into it. They only have, as I mentioned, they only have two picks in this day 1 and 2 range. Pick 15 in the first round and pick 46 in the second round. So they need to hit big on these two positions. For me personally, I went defense with both. I was thinking about potentially going offense with their second round pick, but I'll get into it in a second. Anyway,
Okay.
pick 15 is a very interesting one because I think they're going to have their choice of edge rushers potentially. I am going
Yep.
edge rusher here. Obviously, they need that. And based on how things are going, unless, obviously Abdul Carter is going to go in the top 3, then we're looking at probably Jalen Walker in the top 10. Maybe a Shamar Stewart gets in there if the Saints get a little interesting, at 9. But other than that, I think most of the other pass rushers in this class should be available at 15. For me personally, I decided let's go with the Georgia boy, right? He's from Georgia. He went to school in Georgia. And why not stay in Georgia? And that's Mikael Williams out of Georgia. Uh, I'm a guy that, I'm not extremely high on him, right? He's in my top 40. I believe he's 32 on my board right now. So a little bit lower than consensus on most, but he's 20 years old. He's great in run game. He's okay in pass rush, but he's a guy that you can mold however you want to use him. You can mold him into that kind of player. And he's extremely explosive off the line of scrimmage. And I think he can make an immediate impact in that team. He probably won't be a starter. I'm looking at Leonard Floyd and Ebikite, but unlimited snaps coming off the bench, coming in specific situations, it would be a great place for him to develop into a full-time starter by the end of the season. Then in round 2, pick 46, sticking on the defensive side of the ball, I go with the guy that we just mentioned for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, or no, sorry, for the
New Orleans Saints.
New Orleans Saints, Chavon Revel Jr. out of ECU.
Interesting.
Again, I think corner is a position that they need to go for. We talked about this in, I believe it was the last episode, that these like 4 or 5 corners are all like so close together when we're looking at consensus. I mean, we're looking at Chavon Revel, Benjamin Morrison, Trey Amos, Azariah Thomas, and there was one more, I forget who it was. But anyway, there's a bunch of corners that are all kind of like lumped together and no one knows how to separate them. So it's
Yeah.
all going to come down to teams' preferences, right? And I think Chavon Revel is a good counter to Mike Hughes. Mike Hughes is, quick, a little smaller, and very good in man-to-man. Chavon Revel is bigger, physical. He's going to press a guy off the line of scrimmage, but also have plenty of speed to be able to catch up and cover guys going on deep routes as well. So
Right.
I think he's another guy that is going to drop because of injury. If he didn't get injured, we're potentially talking about him as a first-round pick, maybe even a mid-first-round pick at this point because of his physical profile as well as his production. So you get him at 46 in the second round. I think it makes all the sense in the world as a project and guy that can make an immediate impact when he's healthy.
Yeah, we'll see. And interesting, you had Chavon Revel going 6 picks below where we had Trey Amos of the Saints. I was thinking that maybe you were thinking Chavon will go a little bit higher, but you had him going lower and pass the Saints passing on. Quite interesting. But the first one with the first pick, 15, I agree. I think you take your choice of the top edge rusher, and I think they need to do a lot of research because
Yeah.
that's such a tough position in that range. You got Shamar Stewart. You got to worry about the production, everything, all those issues. You got to worry about James Pierce Jr., the character issues,
Yep.
his love for the game, all that stuff that started popping up before the combine. Michael Williams, you got a little bit of some ankle injury issues he dealt with last year and production issues, and he didn't test very well
Nope.
either that we were expecting him to. And then you have Mike Green with a lot of off the field issues that we don't necessarily have to dive into. But I mean, earlier when I think it was this week, so on Wednesday, ESPN had an article that was Jeremy Fowler talking to scouts and executives, talking about the most polarizing players. And this is a perfect time to talk about him because he had Michael Williams on there, where some scouts, were saying that at one time they were hoping he would be a top 10 pick. The questions remain about Williams and his production, his 40 time, and he's still a dependable, tough player inside, amazing pass rusher, blah blah blah, a great player. And they still think that he can be a first round guy. And then Mike Green, who just for full context is who I have right now penciled in, but it's between Michael Williams and Mike Green.
Yep.
But I mean, Michael Green on tape should be, a top 15 pick. I mean, he led the country in sacks, had like 16 sacks or whatever it was, insane. And then he kind of, tried to address the accusations that were out there during the combine. And you just kind of have to take the risk of, banking on a guy like that in the first round. And that kind of fit with your team. So we'll see what happens. But I agree. It's going to be one of these guys. And it's, Shamar Stewart, Michael Williams, James Pierce, or Mike Green. One
Yep.
of those four, you have to figure out which problem are you willing to deal with. And are you comfortable, rushing off and still selecting the player for the player that he is. So we'll see. And yeah, agreed with with the cornerback pick in the second round. Those are their two biggest needs. So that's the way I'm leaning too. But I think it's between Michael Williams and Mike Green for that pick, and that's the one I'm still tossing up. One of the two options. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I mean the Falcons have such a difficult job there at 15 because I mean I think the obvious choice is going edge rusher there, and I mean when you look at it, Mike Green and James Pierce are probably out of all the guys we just mentioned, probably the two best edge rushers, but their value has gone down because of their off the field problems, right?
Yeah.
Then you go into Michael Williams and Shamar Stewart, who Shamar Stewart, elite athlete, but like almost zero production. And then Michael Williams, who has little production and iffy testing scores.
Yeah.
It's just what do you do here? Like
Hmm.
it's very interesting, and I wouldn't be surprised actually if they end up being a trade back candidate if one of those quarterbacks falls to the mid teens, right?
Hmm.
Like we're looking at it here.
Let someone else make the choice for you.
Let someone else make the choice for you because then if you move back, then you're looking at Donovan Ezraku, or you're looking at one of these guys like James Pierce Jr., Michael Williams, Mike Green, if they drop, right? And it makes your decision a little bit easier because you're not making that pick at 15. You're making it in the mid 20s or late 20s or, wherever. So
Hmm.
I think I don't expect there to be a trade here. I don't think anybody's trading in the 15 to draft a quarterback. I just think it's a little bit too rich for a team like the Browns or the Giants to potentially trade all the way up. Maybe the Steelers. I could potentially see that, maybe, but I don't think they would do that. The Falcons are just going to have a very, very tough time. I think no matter who they pick, they're getting a stud. It's just, you don't know what's one. I can almost guarantee that one of these guys is going to have an issue after
Yeah.
this, right? You just got to make sure that you don't have that guy. Or if all
Yeah.
of them end up having issues except one, you got to make sure you get that guy that doesn't. But then, yeah,
And
as you mentioned, Shavon Revel, like the pick there. Wide receiver was the other place I was looking there as well. Potentially get that, true wide receiver two in there. But I think, the offensive weapons that they have in Bijan, Algier, uh, Pitts, London, I think they can afford to wait until a little bit later and get someone just because these other two needs are just so glaring.
yeah, and after losing, I mean, first of all, like the 15 trade back would be perfect because, like you said, they don't have that many draft picks. They only have
Yep.
five. So moving back and maybe finding, another second round or maybe a third round pick by, a slight trade back with someone like you said, like the Steelers who wants to move up if, Shedeur Sanders falls or whatever the case may be, that helps answer the question of you just kind of take whichever edge rusher falls and let someone else make the hard choices for you. But I wonder if they double up in the second round, thinking about it now after losing Grady Jarrett and how strong the interior defensive line in this class is, maybe instead of corner, potentially an interior D
Yeah.
tackle could be an option for him as well. And you just double up on that D line. But either way, they got some tough choices ahead of what they need to do starting with pick 15.
And it's not what the Falcons want right now because, as I said earlier,
No.
they are probably in the best position to, if obviously Michael Penix has to, play well, but they are probably in the best position to compete in the division
Hmm.
just based on roster construction. So we'll see what happens. But they'll definitely have an interesting a draft night on night one. That'll be exciting to
Yeah. And if
witness.
they nail that edge rusher pick and they get like a stud edge rusher who can dominate,
Yeah.
like that's a big addition to that team. That can go a long way.
All right. So that is the NFC South. Cole, as always, let's get into it. Are there going to be any changes in the standings in 2025?
Not at the top. I think Tampa Bay still runs away with this division, in my mind. So it just depends on what happens at the two after that. I would love Carolina to be the team that makes a jump and gets that number two spot and not a wild card by any means, but wins 7, 8 games and
Yep.
finally Bryce Young has a Bryce Young year and everyone's, rah-rah and excited for the guy like we, were at the end of the year because he looked great.
Yeah.
Things were clicking for that Carolina team at the end of the year. I would love for them to keep the momentum rolling. But it looks like I would say with the Saints flip-flopping QBs potentially, I think the Falcons might be the safe team to come out in the number two spot. But I think only one team goes to the playoffs, and that's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.
Yeah, I agree. I think Tampa Bay ends up coming out on top again. As I mentioned, they could be a 10-win team this year, right? They brought back all their key pieces, and if they have a draft anything like what you mocked here, they're gonna be a better team than they were last year.
Hmm.
So it'll be interesting to see if that comes out. Then the rest of the division is kind of a crapshoot for me. I mean, like it really is just. I mean, who's going to be the best quarterback? I think that's what it's going to end up coming down to. I would not be surprised actually if the Carolina Panthers finish second. I think that's what I'm going to end up predicting here is the Carolina Panthers end up moving up. And then after that, I'm sorry, Mike. The Atlanta Falcons are going to be tied with the New Orleans Saints on record, in my opinion. I think it's going to be extremely close. And I honestly don't know the strength. We don't know what the strength of schedule is going to be, but I mean, one of those two teams is going to be in the bottom, in my opinion, unless the Saints, can stay healthy and figure
Yeah.
something because they've got a good roster as well. But I do think the Carolina Panthers can make a big jump if they get the right pieces in.
hmm And I hope so. That'd be a fun team to see turn around.
Yeah. So, all right, that is it for the South. We have two more divisions to get through. We are just over 2 weeks away from the draft. So we have the AFC West and the NFC West. That is it. We're going to start with the AFC West on Monday, and then the NFC West on Thursday. So we will see you then.
Should be two very fun competitive divisions. I'm excited.
Should be. All right. See you then.